Hi everyone, welcome back to day 2 of MSTC. I'm Henry.
And I'm Rachel.
Together we'll be your hosts for today. So for the past 2 days, we've seen the marvels of AI and we're given insights into how AI is embedded in the engineering and web development field. But these are kinda expected and mainstream, right? So today we will be delving into unknown frontiers, places where people don't expect to see AI. So, ever heard of Grab Pay and Touch and Go? Interesting enough, AI has now ventured its way into the financial sector, delving into the unknown. We'd like to start the day with our finance panel session. So let's hear what our esteemed panelists have to share regarding AI in finance.
Now let us briefly introduce our esteemed panelists for today's session. First of all, we have Mr. Suhasan, a theoretical physics graduate from Imperial College London and currently a data scientist at HSBC. He was previously also an AI product manager and data scientist at MoneyLion. As a data scientist, he designed experiments, developed decision algorithms, and created insightful dashboards. Mr. Suhasan also led AI projects for Instacash, which resulted in achieving significant milestones, including a 1.6 billion origination volume in 2022.
So next we have Mr. Foong Chee Mun, co-founder and former CTO of MoneyLion. Once a scholar of Purdue University, he devoted his career to AI research, leading the charge to develop in-house, world-leading technologies and innovations. Together with a group of friends, he co-founded MoneyLion with the aim of revolutionizing consumer finance with cutting-edge technology and artificial intelligence.
Lastly, let us introduce to you the founder of Ascendant Enterprise, Mr. Victor Tan. As someone deeply passionate about education, Mr. Victor has served hundreds of students through his coaching and tutoring business, Ascendant Academy, and is the creator of the best-selling Udemy course, Transform Your Creative Writing with ChatGPT. He is also a HRDF certified corporate trainer that has performed numerous demonstrations about the use of ChatGPT and AI. Without further ado, let's delve into the world of fintech and start off this panel session.
So we'll be asking some light-hearted questions to get us started. And anyone from the three of you are welcome to grab the mic and provide your answer. So the first one, as we begin to transition into the era of AI, how has AI been slowly utilized in your day-to-day schedule? Has it significantly impacted the operation processes in your company?
Thank you for the question, and good morning to all of you. It is an absolute pleasure to be here. As I kind of demonstrated to some of you in the course of our little morning session earlier, so AI has indeed transformed the way that in fact I work and I communicate. And I'd like to simply provide a simple example right here. So like maybe you are aware of like the ChatGPT app that you can essentially download right here. So what you may not know is that essentially when you go to the ChatGPT app, there's a little audio waveform thing right here. It has become essentially the cornerstone of my communication, how I draft out things, how I create educational programs, and how I essentially create speeches and stuff of that nature right here. For instance, and I think it'll be hard to see right here, if I were to say something like, for example, create me a draft for a lesson plan about the usage of artificial intelligence in finance for an audience of, well, 20 students in a student conference, for example. So then you may see right here that it's just going right here, recording, stop it, and it records every single thing, you see. So you can literally use this for many different types of purposes. And I use this for communicating via text message and various other things of that nature as well. Although that's just more of the perhaps practical type of usage that I utilize this for on a day-to-day basis. And perhaps you guys can also extend if you like have some specific thoughts.
I'm in software development, right? So one of the main thing, I'm sure you guys heard of this trend of generative AI, and one of the main thing that it touches is, in fact, software development. One of the major product that we use on a daily basis is something called Copilot, which help you to potentially write code based on your natural language. Just write your function of first in first out type of messaging system, and you will be able to write reasonable code for that. Beyond that, it's also quite advanced that you can chat with your code. It will also tell you exactly. It can do things like, can you tell me where is likely going to be a bug in the code? And most likely than not, it might have a few false positive, but most time than not, it makes you a more careful programmer, simply because it's like a friend helping you to program. The other thing is that just because this kind of generative AI is being trained across the whole GitHub, I think majority of the GitHub code. So it also teaches you what kind of packages that you can use that you might not know before, because if you code in Python before, there are a lot of packages that they are being released, and it's tough to keep track of it. And the other thing is that if you work in a professional software development environment, you have code check, where like a senior programmer will look at the code for the junior programmers or even other programmers, and make sure that they're generally correct. And nowadays there are AI tools that help you to visualize and tell you potentially where can be problematic in the code that you are reviewing. So it changes a lot of from a software development standpoint. It changes a lot of how you do software development, and I think nowadays the productivity of a software engineer should be multiplied significantly, and a team of like 50 software developers can now be shrunk into like 30 or even less. And obviously these have like different implication on different type of jobs that revolve around software engineering, such as like engineering managers and whatnot. So yeah. So.
Thanks. Good morning, everyone. So from my point of view, so when I was a data scientist, right, so there's sort of two things. First is software development or coding perspective. So I use ChatGPT a lot, so I'm sure most of you use. But if you're on the coding side of data science, sometimes when we think about like how we solve a problem, right, it's not just like I want to just code this, and then you go to like Stack Overflow, or like maybe you think about it. But for sometimes I just go to ChatGPT and like just ask, and sometimes it gives the code, and like not just the code itself, but it will explain, right? So for you to understand what the code does, but also to let others know that this is what the code does. It's more explainable to other people about the code itself. So that's more coding side, and it's less likely, I guess, to get wrong because it's more functional, right? Instead of having some kind of biases, it's just this is what the code does, and you can copy paste, and then you can write it on your own sort of notebook and check whether the output makes sense or not. So that itself improves a lot of time, saves a lot of time, right? Before this, you go to Stack Overflow or something where the solution might not be entirely catered to what you want. So you just try to like piece pieces together, which is still a fun journey, but it takes a lot of time. But now I just go to ChatGPT first and like what it says, especially the coding side, because it's more functional. It tends to get it correct. The next part is more towards, because as a data scientist, sometimes you have to think about problems and like sort of question the science behind it. So I feel like I can use ChatGPT as a person to like, hey, I think this, do you think that? And if so, like justify, and then like sort of have a debate with it. But of course, you need to be aware of its hallucinations, its own bias. But again, that's as a sort of a conversation with another sort of quote unquote scientist, and probably he has a lot of he knows a lot about other, what's going on outside and, bigger database. So you can sort of have a conversation like a particular technical topic or science, and sometimes you can just learn from it and just apply. But still, as a scientist, right, we need to be aware of like where it can go wrong. So we need to be critical. So that's where I mostly use ChatGPT in my own work.
Okay. Right, thank you. Okay. Testing. Okay. Right, so thank you to our panelists. Since we're done with the light-hearted questions, let's go into the juicy bits of our talk today. Alright, so how has AI transformed traditional financial services, and what are the most significant benefits? Maybe we could provide some modern examples of AI-driven innovations that have revolutionized maybe risk assessment or investment strategies. Yeah, maybe you can start off with Mr. Suhasan.
Yeah. So I can talk about an example in MoneyLion, which we're gonna. Yeah. Maybe I'll add on to that. So one of the revolutions that happened in the US, because MoneyLion's a US-based company, is it's the open banking. So the transaction data for a customer is like sort of public, where we can just buy from a third-party provider their transaction history data from any banks, right? So in Malaysia, you probably Maybank, for example, Maybank only has access to their Maybank transaction data. But in open banking in the US, you can, if once you get someone's transaction data, it's applied to everyone. Any bank they have transacted to, you can get. So using this, I'm sure like Chi, one of the problems they try to solve is how can we serve the underbanked in the US? Because US, when you want to talk about loans, we want to credit lending to people, you need to look at their credit score. But these underbanked people might not have a good credit score, so these people will be entirely neglected, right, from the traditional banks. But these people still have the need of like getting that loan, or short amount of loan that they need to survive day to day. So I guess one of the innovations that happened in AI is, how can I not trust or not use credit score at all? How can I use this abundant of data that we have about these people, and how can I serve it, right? How can I make that decision to whether this guy can pay back or not, the credit worthiness. So that was really interesting, and then we saw that we literally don't need the credit score type of thing, and we just need the transaction data, and we use like, first of all we start off with simple rules, but as we used more and more AI, it tends to see that complex relationship between the transaction features, right? Like how often they get paid, maybe they use a particular purchase, which is, it might not be very responsible, let's say, for example. So all that small relationship will be learned by the AI and say, okay, this guy has this score. And that score, I'm not sure if we have really done that cross validation between the actual credit score, but that's a score that we derive from the transaction data for someone who's underbanked, who probably has low credit score, but now with the score we can give them loan, right? We can set that threshold. Maybe there are people with very bad credit score, but maybe they have changed, maybe their recent transactions have improved, and the AI says that his now credit score, the internal credit score is better. So now we can just serve him, right? And time, because in MoneyLion they used to give like loans, and then they still pay back, right? So they've sort of proven themselves. So that's one revolution that happened, where we don't have to rely on traditional credit score, but we have our own AI-driven scores, and we can make decisions based on it. And probably credit scoring that traditionally used is not AI, right? So it might have missed all those complex relationships. There's some subtle nuances that could have helped someone to get a loan amount. So that's one area, credit scoring model that we can use AI in.
Okay, I'm also going to talk about MoneyLion. So by the time Suhasan joined MoneyLion, I think the AI program was reasonably humming. But to bring us back to when we sort of first started, a couple of years after we first started, we from day one of MoneyLion, we bought data and be able to use certain machine learning models to infer creditworthiness. But we still hire human being what we call the human underwriters, the people who sort of like approve or reject your loans, and we still hire them to actually look at the few AI scores by eyes, and then infer the creditworthiness with that. So after 2-3 years of doing it, we accumulated about like 80 human underwriters in our New York office. But it was a lot of trouble because it's a big HR problem, right? Like you need to hire people and people leave, and then you need to replace them. So the CEO or me was just sitting one day and say, hey, why don't we experiment with something? The top 20% of the people that usually the human underwriters always agree with the AI scores. This is, forget about the human underwriters, right? It is automatically good, and we did that, and it was really successful. In fact, that top 20%, the decision making were a lot more coherent, a lot more explainable, because human being human, right? If the guy fought with his wife the day before, he tend to be bad mood, right? So we did it for the top 20%, and being us being us is that we continuously improve it. So we just do the next 20%, next 20%. I think within like 6 or 7 months, we completely eliminated all of the human underwriters. So that's why Suhasan actually was seen in the human underwriters in MoneyLion, and since then our loan book grew like 100 times, right? So the 80 human underwriters, you're talking about like 8,000 people, right? Instead of hiring that 8,000 people, we just increased our AWS Go, and obviously increase the number of data scientists that we have, which is a lot less than 800 people, right? So you can see how AI can potentially change how a financial institution being ran, and what kind of people, composition of people within the financial institutions. So that is one of the more profound impact that AI has in our experience.
Amazing. I too am going to talk about MoneyLion. And in fact, what I'd like to do is basically share a little bit about part of the conversation that we were having a little bit earlier about, well, the nature of risk assessment, credit scoring, and to also draw upon what Suhasan mentioned earlier. So perhaps traditional metrics may end up in some sense, right, disadvantaging certain racial groups, or essentially disadvantaging certain populations that may be traditionally underbanked. But if you consider the nature of AI, so like a lot of people have been talking a lot about how perhaps we should fear essentially AI because there's a risk of biases. But then, as we essentially discussed during the course of our conversation a little bit earlier on, so consider this, right? Like if you were essentially to, well, target, and I think the example that you were using was public bank, right, for example. So like, for example, I am a customer of public bank. Like that's how I got the Gamuda. Well, essentially I got a loan for Gamuda as well. And essentially, imagine if you have, well, someone who might otherwise not really be captured by Gamuda. I'm not saying essentially that there is some element of like say discrimination right here, but if there were essentially a situation where a person were able to in fact pay for a loan, but then essentially were discriminated against, right, for their racial characteristics, well, that'll be bad for the bank because in reality the person can actually, well, pay back the loan, but simply has been discriminated again. And in that sense, so modern financial institutions actually have an incentive, a financial incentive, and not just a moralistic or sort of like hand-wavy type of incentive out there to eliminate that sort of bias in the course of essentially performing those risk assessments. And on a more, I guess, broad level, if we consider the nature of like a lot of the AI systems that we have nowadays, so then it has become increasingly possible, right, not simply to receive certain recommendations, essentially from data to escalate certain cases to perhaps human underwriters, but also to emphasize on being able to ask questions perhaps of your data, as evidenced by the development of certain systems, like for example, Morgan Stanley's next best action, as well as Bloomberg's Bloomberg GPT, which may not particularly be relevant in a particular context of essentially risk assessments in the context of finance, but presages an era where we may be able to move towards a time when it's possible to ask more natural language queries of our data, thereby opening up the sphere of technology to people who previously were more associated with a humanistic bent, as it were.
Maybe I can add on a little bit.
Sure.
Just a little bit on HSBC, so it's not all MoneyLion. It's only been like 5-6 months since I joined HSBC, and coming from like MoneyLion type of companies and to very, very large organizations. And one point that Chi mentioned about replacing the humans. So you guys are gonna guess like how many employees HSBC has all around the world? It's like hundreds of thousands. So all these people making that decisions on that themselves, right? Because one is that the business problem they're trying to solve is complicated. You can't just simplify it with an AI. Because it's so huge, one application of AI that's been pretty it's been well received so far within HSBC is generative AI, because of in the financial industry you have a lot of documents, policies that sort of have a lot of processes, and they sort of define it, say you have to do this, you have to do that. Then people, it might be overwhelming for the employees. So like, because they have a bunch of policy documents in HR that they have to follow, and then within their own business, and especially for like I'm in their internal audit function where we look at a lot of documents. So perhaps one of the use cases of AI they're thinking about is generative AI, where they just train a large language model that knows about HSBC, the policies, and can present as an interface for the employees, for the consumer, particularly what they're looking for. So it can save a lot of time for them to not look into the data, hundreds of pages of policy documents. In one, it can get really long, really technical. So how can we communicate that to the employees so that so you can see how differently it benefits a large organization like HSBC compared to the other credit worthiness type of models in financial industry. Yeah.
So in terms of biases, we share something that has nothing to do with financial industry and nothing to do with MoneyLion. The condo that I live in recently just changed their system from card-based to facial recognition, and I'm sure they bought it from China. So and it works so well for me, but it doesn't work very well for the foreigners. The Anglos, and finally I feel the Chinese pride that.
So, thank you to our panelists. Since we've discussed on the significant benefits, so let's go to the next question. How does AI contribute to personalizing financial services for customers? Are there any specific examples that have been implemented in our life or in your line of work? Have there been any potential challenges that could be faced along the way?
Related to MoneyLion, but it's a different context of like personalized. Because one way that they can personalize what we can offer to the customers is to sort of preemptively predict like what the customers want and when they might want it. For example, we know a customer wants to take out a loan, right? So maybe you can use I'm not sure we actually did use an AI, but one of the AI use cases in that particular sense is sort of predict when the customer might need an Instacash loan, right? So maybe we look at the data that we already have we look at the transaction data. Maybe every week he seems to come back to this particular time, and this is an example. So I want to split into two things. One is sort of simple rule based, known as AI. So the first is the simple rules based, which is like you break down into multiple features and you just try to experiment with it and try to understand if it actually makes sense. So one is like, every week, maybe this particular time he comes to the app and takes it. So the data is there. You just have to see it within your log, your app activity, and sort of recommend, maybe send an email. I'm sure the marketing team has been testing this. You sort of preemptively say, hey, you look like you need this loan. Do you want to take it? Then we take them a quick CTA. So that would not just be helpful for the customers themselves, because now they're like, because maybe they are having that problem at that time, and we are like coming up, like a magic solution. Hey, maybe you could consider this. So before this, the typical marketing team might be looking at it. Okay, let's just blast like millions of emails at this time, because we have this new product. But now it's more personalized, right? We're more personalized to the customer's need, and we preemptively send them the email, which probably has a higher conversion rate of them going and taking the loan. So the challenge is a bit, right? So thinking a bit about it, to sort of personalize these type of like communication, using AI in these communication type of initiatives, is probably the lack of external data. So the bias could also happen because we only use what we have available, which is internal app, but what they do outside might be a blocker, right, for this. So one example is like their social media activities. I'm not sure how open we are to get the social media activity of a customer. Maybe they're already browsing something else. Unless you are Google, right? Then you know what you search on Google Chrome or what you watch on YouTube. It's all like centralized. So they have that advantage. But for a company like MoneyLion or a startup or a standalone company, that lack of company data, the lack of external data might be a blocker for these type of initiatives, and that will probably impact the accuracy of these AI models. That's on the communication.
Well, surprisingly, when it comes to what MoneyLion is really good at, is what we call the high frequency loans. In fact, Suhasan was responsible for it. He was like the PM for it, right? It does loan in such a way that the loan amount actually is corresponding to your spending and your income as well. And surprisingly, income nowadays can be reasonably complicated because a lot of these guys work 2 or 3 jobs because they are gig workers, and a lot of the spending also is extremely variable. So the engine that we built actually look at all of these trend and be able to infer the right amount of loan at the right amount of time for them. And it's much more important. Like timing is extremely important in this kind of product because you want to be able to get the repayment back at the right time, because you also don't want to unduly burden the customer when you get the money when he doesn't have money, right? So it doesn't make sense. And being able to automatically personalize based on AI is extremely important, because like sometimes when the customers tend to have like a certain increase in income, so the amount of loan will automatically increase, and if they happen to spend frivolously for the last few days, we tend to penalize that as well. So this kind of personalization, despite the fact that it is not like Google personalization or Facebook personalization, but more of a financial personalization, is extremely important for financial responsibility as well. Because as a financial institution, you have to make sure that the consumer, when they take credit, they are able to, they can afford it.
Alright, so our previous 2 panelists spoke a little bit about, loans and loan allocations, and I'm just wondering, right, but how many of you out here, you well, invest money, or like you have the intention of investing money. I know that you're students right now, but like, I mean, like, how many of you have the intention of like, say, making an investment or like investing like within the near time horizon, 5-10 years from now? I don't know. Like, can I get a show of hands? Oh, whoa! Okay, great. So, right, now, one of the things that essentially has come up in recent days is in fact the development of robo-advisors. And the reason that I relate this right now to essentially the context that we've mentioned earlier is that, well, so Morgan Stanley's Next Best Action does essentially offer like recommendations for like how essentially you might invest your money, and so that's essentially the Index GPT, but it's part of a broader class of, well, shall we say, robot financial advisors. And now, as essentially, well, our panelists spoke a little bit earlier on, so then certain things, right, may influence the kind of advice essentially that an expert may give in certain cases. It may be their mood, it may be like, for example, how they feel on a particular day right there. But an algorithm, of course, algorithms may change on a day-to-day basis, right? But essentially, they will provide advice, right, based on various things of that nature. If you've not heard of, well, a robo-advisor, so essentially, what it is a digital platform that provides automated, algorithm-driven financial planning investment services with little to no human supervision. So you might consider a whole bunch of different things along the way as you kind of like invest. You might invest in property, you might invest in stocks, you might invest in, like, for example, all nature of financial instruments here and there. But you may consider that, for example, in the human world, so a financial planner or financial advisor, so like sometimes they may have like their own incentives essentially to, well, have you invest in a particular product. I'm not saying that that's impossible within the ambit essentially of a robo-advisor. But essentially, you know, if you are looking for something to manage your investments for you at a relatively low cost and to personalize, right, based on your goals, because typically these advisors, right, they will ask you essentially like, oh, okay, so like what is your goal, for example. Can you describe a little bit about like your risk profile or various other things of that nature? You can have questions also about like your current income or various other things of that nature. And they can essentially provide advice to you on that basis. So it's cool that essentially, yes, you have loans, and of course you have, in the context of MoneyLion, well, various actions that can be taken to essentially improve, well, customer capture, retention, or stuff of that nature right there. But also on the investment front, so we see significant strides forward in the capacity of these kinds of platforms essentially to provide advice and also investment action. Because sometimes, right, like even the decision to invest might not just be, you know, something that you choose not to do, because like you may know, but you know, you may just have the resistance inside you, which perhaps you may feel more comfortable allocating to an algorithm rather than to your own personal feelings of, I want to change my life, what do I do? So yeah, that's something I would submit for all of you to consider.
Alright, so just to summarize, Mr. Suhasan, you mentioned about sending personalized emails, but due to the lack of external data, let's say the influence of social media and all that, so it may not be that appropriate. And for Mr. Foong, you talked about the personalized the loans and how they look at different factors. So like it can be more personalized. And as for Mr. Victor, he talked about the robo-advisors and how it can impact on investments. Alright, so now I'll be going into the challenges in reliability, safety, and security. So one of the most important factors when implementing a new strategy or adapting to a new concept is always to consider reliability and safety. With that being said, what are the primary concerns regarding the reliability and safety of AI in the finance sector?
From and obviously in financial institutions, you use it for creditworthiness, which we talk about just now, but you also use it for a lot of times for fraud, anti-fraud, and also anti-money laundering. If you guys know what it is, but essentially people putting a lot of money into your bank and try to whitewash it, criminal activities. And AI is really good in predicting this, using something, essentially detecting our lives, and at least it reduce the search space that you have for this kind of activities, and thus allow financial institution to be more reliable, catering towards real customers instead of criminals. So that's I think that's one of the area that AI can greatly help the social situation. But in terms of like reliability and biases within a model, I personally think that AI generally is a lot more explainable and a lot more predictable and reliable than say a human being. Simply because, like say, you fight with your wife, you tend to be in bad mood, or if you're hungry, you tend to be in bad mood. So generally, I think they are actually. Maybe I'm an AI optimist, but I just think that there are very little downside in utilizing AI in financial decisioning or most any decisioning at all.
Yeah, slightly paint a different picture, right? Because we have like very big organizations like HSBC or so, because when they want to make a financial decision, it's just like, even though I sort of agree that probably AI is more explainable, like you can have like or the sort of, even if the accuracy is really high for an AI model, it's the humans consciousness of this when it comes to big financial decisions for some of the financial institutions. They still want that explainability and like sort of reliability, or like someone to take responsibility for the outcome from that model. I guess even if you show like a very good results, they sort of still want to see like why we made this decision, and especially if it's coming from a regulator's perspective, especially from internal audit. These are sort of the blockers that come with implementing an AI solution at a very big scale. Essentially, like if something goes wrong, because finance is a pretty risk management, risk heavy business. So you sort of know where the risk is. You sort of always want to predict where that thing is. So if an AI model turns out a wrong output, of course we can explain it. Some technical like SHAP analysis and so on. But at the end of the day, like if something, like we were having this conversation, right? If something goes wrong, especially in a finance industry, depending on the scale of the impact, right, the output, it could have multiplying effect of an economy. Like if one of the very big loans that we give out was based on the AI output and it actually outputted wrongly, which means it could be millions of dollars in loss. So who do we frame that? What do we do, right? And so that type of like trust, explainability, accountability, it's going to be a problem, but we have to figure it out together, I guess. It's at least the conversation I had with very big the senior people in HSBC type of companies. This is their main concern, because whatever they were already doing, it's working. So it's just comparing that pros and cons and see, sure, AI will give me this much benefit, but I have a pretty high, pretty low risk appetite in that area of explainability. What do I do? So that's something probably going to exist in very big organizations. So that's something we really have to think about.
Thank you. So I'd like to thank the panelists for the contribution so far, as we kind of like now move into also a discussion of reliability in an alternate context. And for that, I'd like to speak a little bit about history. And again, I will speak about investment in this case. So in essentially 1998, there was a particular hedge fund that was called Long-Term Capital Management, created by one of the brightest minds, some of the brightest minds from my university, the University of Chicago. Nobel Prize economists, Myron Scholes, and like various other thinkers basically came together. they created essentially trading algorithms, right, in order to invest essentially within the stock market, creating a portfolio that initially at the outset was, well, returning 21% first year, 43%. I don't exactly remember the numbers right here. But when you automate essentially an algorithm, right, then what ends up happening is that you perhaps may end up creating rules, right, that may, well, become essentially, well, inapplicable within certain specific situations. Like, for example, well, Russia, for example, defaulting, thereby causing, in the case of the LTCM scenario, essentially, well, a failure for the algorithms to respond because they had never been programmed for a Russian default. So then there is essentially that risk of certain rules, right, being misapplied in certain cases, or computerized rules essentially failing to respond adequately. Although, of course, I do also acknowledge so what our previous panelists mentioned earlier about how in certain cases, maybe even if we were to consider, well, the situation where you're trying to explain an AI algorithm, right, so then it raises the question then, right, if essentially, you know, like we face some trouble with AI right there, then perhaps we might consider, before we make a premature judgment about AI in the very first place, right, can we perhaps explain essentially the behavior of human beings as well? I mean, like, to what extent can we actually do so right here? And as we think about reliability and safety right here, so it's crucial, I think, to remember that yes, there are essentially AI algorithms that we are using to different degrees and in different situations right here, but at the end of the world, so like, these are very much human-created technologies in service of human-centric outcomes, and it's just good to be aware of that. And while I don't necessarily have a resolution for the whole idea of like LTCM and various other things of that nature, I would say that, well, there are certain, well, case studies in history which you can look at, and it's good to consider, I guess, history and to make your own decisions about like what is right and what is not. But the technology will eventually develop in various ways, and in some sense, Pandora's box has already been opened, and it's difficult to be able to close it.
Alright, so just to summarize, I think the panelists have mentioned that the AI is good for prediction and it is more explainable because, well, Mr. Foong has mentioned that it is not affected by emotions. And as for the challenges, Mr. Suhasan and also Mr. Victor has mentioned about the trust issue and how humans need to take charge of the final output. So right now we'll be moving into how does the financial sector ensure the security of AI-driven systems against cybersecurity threats.
So maybe I can speak a little bit about this because, well, one thing actually that is done, right, is this idea of what we call, so there's actually a job, right? How many of you out there, okay, so like, just out of curiosity, like how many of you out there are like computer science students, or like you have essentially, well, developed some interest in coding in some way, shape or form? Can I get a show of hands maybe? Okay, cool. Did you know that there is a job out there that will allow you to hack into a bank? Okay, no, seriously, like you can go right ahead and you can Google it right now, like penetration testing. It is basically a profession whereby essentially a bank, right, will essentially hire engineers to hack into their own systems as a way of essentially, well, figuring out, right, how secure essentially those systems are to essentially black hat initiatives or essentially the things that people might exploit. The idea here is that before I get exploited in the very first place, I shall attempt to exploit myself. And it's essentially a kind of like advanced self-evaluation right here, and it's a field that you can actually get compensated pretty well for if you choose to actually enter it. And you can literally just tell people out there, hey, so like maybe like you go for like Chinese New Year dinner, then like basically then people ask you, what do you do for a living? Then you just like look at them for a while and like, yeah, I hacked into Hong Leong Bank yesterday. Some of that nature right there. So, I mean, that is one of the things that, well, banks do in order to maintain security in these times right here. And it's just one case of many right here, but perhaps some of our other panelists can also share.
Yeah, pen testing is big in banking industry, or actually in any industry. I think you pay people around the world, and there are bounties to it. Like you set aside a certain amount of money, a few $100,000, and when people hack into you, you can set up a program that pays that the specific hacking. So in financial institution, you usually have like the people who all of them are white hats, and but you have the blue team, and the blue team essentially help you to strengthen your security, and then you have the red team who trying to hack into whatever the blue team has done. So it's pretty interesting situation. It's pretty interesting career, and I think going forward, just face it, more and more things are going to be digitized, and most of the innovation for the last 20 years, digital innovation. So which means that more and more such profession will be needed, and in this particular case, in our experience is that the advancement of Copilot, this kind of coding advisory or coding friend type of technology from AI that helps a lot because it automatically tells you, okay, potentially certain part of your code is not as secure as it should be, and you will come up with like suggestion on how to fix it, and that's something that that I think the financial institution around the world will use more, and specifically. I think the usage of big AI models in financial institution, can it be hacked or not? In my opinion, is that I don't think it's very easy to hack these kind of models simply because of how dynamic these kind of models are. And I from the trend, we just talk about it from the trend. One very specific security threat for AI model is called the pixel attack, where you change a certain pixel in a picture and be able to throw off the system entirely. And from a human vision standpoint, you will not be able to detect the change of pixel. So this kind of attack is demonstrated a lot in the computer vision world, but in the finance world, I think it's pretty hard to do it because you have to understand the model very well, and people like us who actually have practical experience in deploying models is that you deploy models all the time, and thus it's kind of tough for any of the hackers to try to catch up with that kind of pixel attack type of problems.
So the last example he mentioned, Chi mentioned, was it's called adversarial attacks. So it happens in all sort of AI models where you know that the AI is making a decision, and you sort of want to change the data in a way that you know it will, when I put this into that, it will give me the desired outcome that I want, right? So this is sort of quote unquote hackers. It can realistically happen. It's a real problem. It's called adversarial attacks. But like as Chi also mentioned, you sort of have to know how the AI system works quite thoroughly, right? And another point is also because the computer vision is sort of pretty unstructured data, whereas in transaction data or the data that we might use in a financial institution, AI models, it's probably a bit more like zeros and ones, a bit more structured. So I'm not sure how feasible it is to change that and play around with it because it's numbers are numbers, right? But I want to touch on the other cybersecurity threat, which is about the data security part, because when you want to train a model, right, you need a lot of data. So that could include very sensitive data, personal data. So you don't want Google to know your financial transaction data, right? Like your spouse might not know about the entire thing. So it's a pretty sensitive data that you are pretty, and in our early conversation, like Chi mentioned, that he puts a lot of trust in bigger banks, because it's bigger banks, right? So you need to win the trust from them, and people associate trust with their data privacy, or the data, how protected their data is. So one of the interesting problem is you want to get more data to train the models, right? So you want to get what this person does, but how do we sort of translate the data to the model itself? For example, your phones, right? Phones have personal data or transaction data, and let's say there's an AI model sitting in a server, let's say Maybank. Does the Maybank just downloads your data and then saves it there? So one of the things that they're thinking about, and like one of the data governance principle is data sharing principle is like, maybe you anonymize your data and then you send it to the server, or do you just copy paste it, or you can also do more aggregate techniques. For example, instead of I just copy paste your data, I aggregate. So maybe the people around in this area, I'll aggregate, just take the average, so that not one person's personal identifiable information will be like sort of shared. So these are sort of examples what engineers are already thinking about, how we transfer data from, in terms of the training perspective, right? Because the more data you have, the better the model is. So you cannot just like take all the data, save it somewhere, and then train it, because the more you save it like that, the more risk you have, and probably the PDPA will come after you if you could try to save it like that. So in financial industry, that sensitiveness of the data is really huge, and in Malaysia, I think we'll talk about it, like the PDPA, Bank Negara takes it very, very seriously. So one of the it will be a challenge in terms of how we train the data, how we keep the data.
Can I ask a question to you guys? So I'm just curious, right? But what are your thoughts on using essentially generative models to create synthetic data? You have any thoughts on that?
I don't think we tried that. Did we try that? I don't think finding synthetic data is very useful. I think for like self-driving and stuff like that, it might be more useful. Let's say from a privacy standpoint, they're forefront of AI research. I don't know if any of you guys some of you guys are in computer science, right? So if you are interested into this kind of topic, there is a burgeoning field that research into. Nowadays, AI is essentially synonymous with machine learning, which the stuff that we did in MoneyLion, which is really just throw everything into like a big ass neural net and hope things are coming out really well. Okay, it's slightly more complicated than that, like you deal with the structure and stuff like that. But after you put like a whole bunch of data and literally like terabytes of data, and hope that your prediction is reasonably correct, you cannot go back and say, okay, maybe I'll take away 3% from the training from the model. You cannot, right? So unless you take away from your input data and retrain the whole thing, which is really expensive. Training is really expensive. I think there is a burgeoning research that particularly try to change how the model is being created in such a way that you can say, okay, my database has Suhasan in it, but tomorrow Suhasan say, hey, I don't want my data to be fed into your model, and you'll be able to single out that part of the data and take it out. So that's something that if any of you guys are interested in doing, that's apparently like the most forefront of AI research.
Thank you.
How come we get the last question?
All right, thank you, panelists. So right now I'll be moving into your future perspectives. So as we begin to adapt to the adjustments of AI, what do you see as the future trends in using AI in finance, particularly in emerging markets?
So I guess emerging markets like Malaysia and those areas. So one thing I'm observing is like in companies like Google, IBM, they're really going all in for the AI type of tools and innovations, right? And then me working in a, in MoneyLion and in banks in Malaysia, I sort of still observe that disconnect between like companies like Google, Apple and IBM. If your data is not secure, or when you want to put it into your AI model, then your customers will start questioning. So you need to first, at least from in an emerging market where we might not be as advanced as like IBM or Apple, we need to figure those things first, even though it might be tiring right now because it's not the AI part, right? So at least once we figure that out, and as a data scientist, I also believe, no matter how big your AI, how fancy your AI tools is, garbage in, garbage out, right? So if you don't fix that the data issue right now and sort of standardize and think a little bit more about that problem first, then we go into AI, then I think it will be even more beneficial for AI to give that value, rather than we forget about the data and then we, like you said, like we make decision based on the AI, which is not clean. And then in the future we think like, oh, maybe I don't want this data, maybe I want to make these changes. Then we go back, right? And then we still haven't figured out that root cause or the fundamental problem of data. Because once you do that as a data scientist, as my life, I can spend less time on like cleaning and like arguing with stakeholders like this data should be this, it should be that. There should be a good data culture, I think, in terms of managing data and then preparing the data. And I've been seeing like even Affin Bank, like they are going on in a data enterprise data initiative. So I'm not sure what they're doing, but it looks like they are trying to like consolidate everything so that they can be ready for AI. And once that happens, I think what happened in MoneyLion, like you said, I think from when I joined MoneyLion, it was mostly very clean. It was most of the data, because they have a very good data engineering team. The data has been taken care of so that we can come in and just focus on AI and analytic solutions that can drive to value. So in emerging markets in Malaysia, it's okay for them to go and just do AI. I'll still question the value of it, but at least think about the longer term data as an infrastructure.
I think for a financial institution standpoint, especially, I'm sure you guys heard of like the new 5 digital banks that were introduced by Bank Negara, and because of the advancement of AI, I think the cost of innovation comes down significantly. As I mentioned just now, the cost of software development, the cost of software testing, the cost of software understanding has gone down dramatically, and thus I think around the region, Malaysia especially, there should be a better focus on customer experience, where the banks get to focus more on like the personalization or specific use cases that the big banks are not catering to, simply because of the reduction of the cost of innovation. So and other thing is that because of the advance of digital bank, I think essentially most banks will convert into something. Essentially, these kind of banks are really a technological layer that stores a lot of money. So the change will be that much of the workers in the bank, currently if you look at CIMB, I bet there are less than 20% of them are technological workers, whereas in digital banks and potentially even in CIMB or Maybank in the near future is that 80% of it will be technological related workers, such as data scientists, programmers, product managers, and such.
Thank you. So, in relation to what she mentioned earlier, so he was mentioning essentially that there is essentially a need for, better, I mean like the cost essentially of developing software is going to go down in various different ways, but at the same time, there's a broader question of like who is actually going to implement those kinds of changes. So in order to really make it so that emerging markets can actually have integration really of essentially a good data structure, or essentially the right things in place in first place, So you would definitely need, well, people like yourselves out there, like students essentially, who are capable of understanding these things. So round of applause to you guys for being here at this panel today. Yep. So definitely, well, I know that it's often, like taken as, something that's very, shall we say, cliche. But truly, I do believe that each one of you out here is a treasure of the nation, and that you have the capacity in many ways to contribute to things that are greater than yourselves. And I think that although it's true that the world out there is competitive, well, as long as you're resourceful, you can find yourself in many different ways. But there are going to be some specific skills, of course, that you would need to develop in order to ensure that you can actually, well, participate in that future out there. But you can go ahead and have a look at maybe the kinds of job listings, I guess, for different types of positions out there to ascertain what kinds of skills you may need as well. But of course, your individual skill, right, is essentially a necessary condition, but it's not a sufficient one to essentially, well, create that sort of situation whereby an emerging market like Malaysia can actually get to a competitive position. You can develop talent, right? But think about it this way, right? You can have a Ronaldo, for example, on a football team, but then if everybody else cannot work together with that Ronaldo in order to make the whole team move forwards to a victory, then it's impossible to do that, because life is about something that is bigger than yourself. And I know that life is very, very touchy-feely word, but if you consider, say, a financial system, what is it but essentially a microcosm of individual human decisions right there that in some sense we are formalizing? And if we consider that entire ecosystem, our economy, and all levels of essentially human participation within our community, there is a need for, well, government to be able to work better with its existing talent in order to, well, listen to that talent, and also the needs of industry in an increasingly global, interconnected world to determine what steps need to be taken forward.
Alright, thank you, panelists. So just as a summary, Mr. Suhasan has mentioned that we should look into the long-term challenges of AI and ensuring the quality of the data. Mr. Foong has mentioned about the focus on customer experience, particularly in personalization. And Mr. Victor has also mentioned that we need more talent in this industry to further develop AI. So I'll pass it to Henry for the closing remarks.
Okay, thank you, Rachel. So, first of all, we'd like to thank you for being part of the session today. It's always a pleasure to bring in some of the brightest minds in Malaysia to inspire our audience. Just a final question, is there any advice that you would like to give to young, passionate students, as we are, who are wishing to pursue the financial field? Yeah, so maybe we can start with Mr. Victor.
Sure. So on a day-to-day basis, what I do is that I advise students on essentially, and this may seem essentially somewhat unrelated, but I do advise students on how to apply essentially the top universities. Numerous members of Harvard's class of across the years, I guess, have gone for, from Malaysia, have gone for essentially sessions from me in different areas right here. But I don't intend to advertise my services, but what I do intend to say is that essentially any outcome, whether you get a job or anything else of that nature, it depends on how you present yourself, how you sell yourself, what you do in order to convince people of your, I guess, validity. And sometimes you may not necessarily be able to do so, right, with objective, I guess, metrics, but to the extent that you can, right? So if you can cite specific things essentially on your CV, or skills essentially that are relevant to the job descriptions that basically you can find on the internet, then essentially, yeah, you should do that. If you're going to go out there, then definitely consider also, right, that when you are talking about say finance, right, another aspect of, well, AI beyond finance is also recruitment. And consider that in the modern age, right, so it's possible to have more than 100 different applications for a single position, and accordingly, so although we talk about AI in finance so far, there's also AI in resume screening and recruitment. And so when you are writing your resumes or like anything else of that nature, then just make sure to like pay attention to like keywords and to also other things, right, that an AI may look for right there. At the end of the day, of course, HR is a time-consuming and an expensive process because of the level of involvement that people essentially have in that process. It is unavoidable though, because at the end of the day, we have to find people that we can actually work with, right? So it's a combination of being able to understand that you will probably be screened by an AI for things like, I don't know, like GPA or like, for example, previous internships or like certain specific skills or linguistic capabilities that you have right there. But also recall that at the end of the day, so like we live in a human world where to the extent that we are going to continue working with humans, I don't think, by the way, that it's a determined outcome already that we will, and it's very popular for like people on social media to say like, oh, you know, like it's definitely going to be the case that you know, like we will have a situation where humans and AI work together. More thoughts about that a little bit later on, but that particular philosophy is called centaurism, and it is not something that's like historically determined, right? That we are going to essentially continue to have a role in this world. But to the extent that we have the world that you understand right now and the world that we live in right now, we are a human-centered society that serves to cater to the needs of human beings in various different ways. And it's crucial to remember that while at the same time navigating the complex currents of technology as they make certain things possible that were not available to even the kings of the eras that had come past.
Okay. On that topic, as practical practicing creator of AI, me and Suhasan, I don't think there is a straight way of replacing all human beings with AI. I don't think it's possible, and I don't think it's possible for AI to, you know, like you the alarmist out there that says, okay, AI will replace human, or AI will be the enemies of human. We don't know how, simply because we create the system and we tell the system what to do, despite the fact that it's using a whole bunch of AI behind it. I think the people who raise this kind of alarms are generally are not practicing AI creators. They're more philosophers. So we don't know how to do it. But in terms of advice, I say be extremely agile and prepare to learn throughout your lifetime of new things. As we can see, innovation accelerates, which means that there are more and more for any one of us to learn. And much more importantly, do not have a very fixed idea of what your career is going to be, because for example, my title as a CTO, it wasn't invented when I started my career, so there's no such thing. I didn't go out there, when I grow up I want to be a CTO. Unlike dentists, unlike doctors, unlike lawyers, right? And same thing with Suhasan's title, which is data scientist. I think I'm quite sure you did not go out wanting to be data scientist, because there's no such thing as data scientist when you go out, right? So which means in the next 5 years, in the next 10 years, and hopefully your career will be the next 40 years, you might assume like maybe 3 or 4 titles that right now none of us have ever heard of. So which means that you need to learn new things, you need to be open to new situations, and finance will always be here. Finance is firstly is important because unlike people who design like the next music player and whatnot, it affects lives, but it doesn't affect life as much as finance. So it is an industry that will be here for quite some time.
So just want to share something. So in HSBC, right, when I joined, and they have this induction program, so it's like 30-40 people, it's the first time they introduce like what the bank is to people, and they go around like, so they were going around and asking like, what's your name, what's your role, and like every one of them were like either legal compliance or bankers, and then when I mentioned data scientist, they all clapped. I don't know why, they clapped like why. So and then they started studying like, oh, I've never seen a data scientist in HSBC before. So And this is something slowly that change is happening, right? As she mentioned just now, more and more people in the big organizations will be more tech driven. So that's why you can sort of stand out. And if you're going in the finance industry, and from what I've talked to the senior people in banks, they really, really value people who are tech driven, who are data driven. So because in Malaysia, at least from what I've seen, like I can share with you guys, is a lot of them are still base their decision based on their intuition, like not much very data driven. So they can't really explain like justification. So that type of culture is still ongoing, right? I think that's to some degree in almost all companies. So if you want to be like sort of be the guy that challenges and differentiates, you can base anything in data. No one's going to question, right? If the data says this, like no one's going to question you. So you can build your credibility based on that type of mindset. So that's on the mindset point of view in terms of data driven. That can apply to all industries, right? But in financial industry, because you need to make decisions, that's why you have hundreds of thousands of people. You make decisions whether to reject this loan or approve this loan. So if we are moving towards AI, sure, that's AI will make that decision, but you yourself sort of propagate that I will make my decision based on data, justification, and that's good for the industry and the company overall, right? Because that's fewer mistakes that can do because you're basing on data. And in MoneyLion type of companies, it's like, and when I was AI product manager, it needs to be, like, the question is always about, okay, I want to make a decision, is there any data, anything that can back it up? So I always go and search. So then I will present it to the stakeholders, they will be a lot more confident. This is, I think, pretty general, like it can apply to, because you always have to pitch ideas to people, right? So that mindset will make it very different, make it stand out from others who are like very book smart, who are like very much, I memorized this, and what, touching on what she also mentioned about being agile. So that's my mindset, and agile, right? So one thing I've always been thinking about is, instead of titles, instead of what exact thing you want to do, you should be focusing on, that is my philosophy, is something like what Elon Musk has been telling, it's the first principle, or you can really focus on what value you're actually adding. Because as finance industry not go away, right? We need to understand what value are you providing to finance. You're not just approving loans, you're actually making a decision so that the money goes to the guy, and so that the guy pays back. So if you break it down into that first principle, and if you do like physics, that type of stamp degrees, you always go down to first principle. So the reason I'm telling you is because you don't have to focus on a particular career or like the title. It's more about what is the career adding to the world, what value are you adding, because that value is not going to go away. For example, for us to give a loan to someone so that they can go and spend that money to something else, so that's a very fundamental thing, right? And AI, before this we were using humans to approve, now we're using AI, and in the future it will be something else. So for you to keep up on that, but always understand what the value is, because there's a lot of noise, I think, in this world. If people say you do this, you just stick on it, but if you break it down into the first principle and say, oh, I'm actually doing this for this reason, once you understand that, you can filter all this noise and stick to that value, because now you'll be focusing your most of your energy into that thing that matters. And so far I've been seeing that pays off in the career. So focus on the value, more about what value you deliver than how you deliver, whether AI or any other solution. The solution might change. And also the problem, right? The problem and the values are the more important things.
Okay, so that was good advice that I think we all can bear in mind. So just to recap what has been given, so we start off with Mr. Victor, who said to improve on our personal branding and also marketing, all right, to improve our, how should I say, value in the job hunt market. And then secondly, from Mr. Foong, which is to adopt this agile learning mindset, and of course to be open to other career opportunities and not just be limited to our field of study or our initial field of work. And the last one from Mr. Suhasan, which is to be a data-driven person for us to be able to deliver compelling justifications, and also to focus on value creation in our careers and not just chasing the titles. Alright, so thank you to our panelists for the fruitful discourse. Next, we will proceed with a brief Q&A session to satisfy our audience's queries. So to our audiences, should you wish to ask any of our panelists questions, you may do so by raising your hand, followed by your question. And my own personal suggestion, now be a good time to ask them how to get rich, since they're from financial institutions. So grab the chance.
My name is Ian, and I would say that my question wouldn't really be AI related, but since MoneyLion crypto is one of the products offered in MoneyLion, so I want to ask regarding a bit of blockchain. Now, do you think that blockchain has a place in the fintech industries, and whether such as like use cases maybe can replace the traditional payment system such as SWIFT, or even replace our current fiat currencies?
I'm the guy who put crypto in MoneyLion. It's I think the blockchain technology itself is interesting, and I think it was a technology that is really interesting specifically for cryptocurrency. And if you ask me, I think cryptocurrency will play a much bigger life, and this is a inversion of what I think a lot of people are saying, that like, cryptocurrency might not matter, but blockchain might survive. But I just think that the blockchain technology itself, despite how interesting it is, it doesn't seem to catch on any real world application except for cryptocurrencies, right? So with that, I just think that like, cryptocurrency might survive hundreds of years or tens of years into the future, but the blockchain specifically itself, I don't see too much of real world usages of it, and the few real world usages of it tend to be very small, and the nature of blockchain is that it is decentralized and it is permissionless, which means that if it's small, then there's no point to it, right? It has to be big. It has to be utilized by a lot of people. So and however, something like Bitcoin, I'm not saying that everyone should go and buy Bitcoin, but something like Bitcoin is extremely interesting because there's no central bank that governs it. Like all fiat currency has central bank governing it. That's the only thing in the world. That's the only currency in the world that is not governed by any particular person or government. So I think it has its value in the world.
Alright, so are there any other questions? Alright, so I think I'll ask a question. How do you see the future of AI in your company?
Okay, there's been a lot of talk, a lot of hype, and a lot of talk about like using generative AI. And I'm not sure I've talked about this, like how I think I did how we have a lot of documents, in HSBC type of companies, and how they can put generative AI. So generative AI has been that talk a lot, which is because the risk of like having that type of models compared to a credit assessing model, I guess it's a bit lower, because what's the worst can happen, right? Maybe someone's misinformed. But of course, because the way how things work in big companies with approval and stuff, you always have that blocker, but you don't let that AI model to take full ownership of it. So in terms of what is going to happen in HSBC type of companies, at least they are trying to figure out the data part of it. They are preparing for it, and just to share, like Malaysia is not the R&D hub for this type of AI platforms, right? Because they have like bigger HQs, so they have their own research institutes that's going on, what they can do with AI and the internal HSBC data. But overall, with what's happening with other bigger banks, they're also still looking into like, okay, AI is a thing that could generate a lot of positive things, but they're still still a bit cautious, and it feels like it's still looking like what the competitors are doing and whether we are ahead of them, and the actual value equation, because at the end of the day, these banks I think are still quite profitable, quite successful. So they need to push for the pros and cons, right? The cost and the benefit is still there. So the positives are still there, unless you have companies like MoneyLion that comes in, like challenges them themselves because they have been innovating. So it's going there. I wouldn't say it's as fast as like MoneyLion type of companies, because MoneyLion is very focused on one particular problem, and like I said, right, it's about the fundamental first principle, which is more about cost benefit. If you can justify the benefit is so huge and cost is less, why wouldn't they do it, right? And of course the company would have done it. So all these forces are at play, right? It's not as easy as AI is simple, AI is easy, let's do it. I think that's a bigger picture of it. But I think as more and more people are putting more effort into AI type of innovations, of course more and more competition there will be, which means more good things, and AI will just keep on growing, right? And I hope they will hire more data scientists so they won't ban.
Alright, so thank you so much. I think we can have one last question.
So basically, right, our panel session has been discussing mostly on benefits and usage of AI in a business owner and a company perspective. So I'm just going to ask one from the consumer end. It might sound childish to some people. Okay, so it's probably going to be two. One is the childish version of it, and the other one is the slightly matured and educated version of it. So I'll start with the childish one first. How can I use AI as a consumer to get me rich? And the matured version of it is, how may I use AI to sufficiently manage my finances to amass wealth?
Well, okay, so I generate a fair number, and this is more relevant, I guess, to like those of you who are going to be attending like the personalized learning debate a little bit later on. So I generate a variety of digital products and essentially sell those online. I do have essentially freelancers that I do work with in order to make those digital products possible in the very first place. But if we talk about like, say, consumer facing in the very first place, so then things that you can do, essentially, well, you can essentially learn, I mean like, just because you're using AI, by the way, like I like to emphasize that you're not going to like be able to just generate something with ChatGPT and then immediately start selling it. No, you need a certain amount of like social cachet, like the ability to persuade, charisma, like basically those are things that are going to be the true drivers of whether or not you can actually, well, amass some degree of wealth with AI. And well, if you talk about, say, well, consumer facing, right? I guess like there are different types of consumers. I mean, like if you were to, for example, I don't know, like build a subscription service in some way, shape, or form, then and you use essentially like the ChatGPT API, then are you then a consumer or are you then now a producer? What is the boundary? So then I would have to ask you to clarify the question then.
You just want to get rich.
Okay. Yeah, like I don't know, like go on social media. I don't know, you can sell books, become an AI YouTuber.
Probably mostly I think on the more common people type of thing. So like most of us here we do investments. So yeah, kind of thing like maybe how we can utilize AI to make better investments or that sort of thing, or like allocating our money.
Well, in response to that, I would say I wouldn't recommend a specific platform. And in the first place, like, you know, if you want to do certain things like, say, well, purchase something that represents the stock market, you could just buy essentially the like the spider index, SPY, if you have essentially intentions of, like, if you don't know what the SPY is, so essentially the S&P 500, right, is an index that compiles essentially the 500 well, most prominent companies essentially in the US, and essentially the spider, as it is called. So what it does is that it essentially is, well, an index, right, that tracks essentially all of these stocks, and therefore the returns of that will match the overall upward trajectory of the stock market. So I would say that, like, if you want a situation whereby you just want to invest in something and then you have a belief essentially in the general upward trajectory of the stock market, then yeah, I mean, like, you can just go right ahead and buy that. But and of course there are going to be some algorithms to perhaps help you to invest better or stuff of that nature right there, but you do have to do your own due diligence. And at the end of the day, it's worthwhile to note that a classic investment maxim is that past results are no guarantee of future returns. And whether you think or believe that somehow or another an AI algorithm is capable of holding the fate of your entire financial future in its hands or not. So, I mean, like, that belief unfortunately will collide with reality because, well, you are responsible for your own financial future. So there's no automatic way of, like, getting rid of that responsibility for your financial future. You will need to continually think. And if there is the thought that basically, oh my gosh, like, can I automate myself towards riches? No. I like to completely disavow any possible notion of that. No. If you think that's possible right now, well, unless of course somehow you inherit like $15 million from your parents or something, in which case then yes, then you automatically do get rich. Well, yeah, no, you have to think about your financial future. So sorry to disappoint. You wanna?
So how to use AI to get rich? Data scientist.
Ooh. Yes, better answer.
Well, one way is to go into that field and like think about how we can make money from that as a solution, right? Because there are a bunch of problems, you just need to connect that. Like how Chi found that that's a problem, and we use AI to find that, and in that we find a way to make money from that, right?
And then sell the company.
To sell the company. It's a profitable company.
Consumer.
Yeah, so that's in terms of the going into AI as a career or as a product. Sounds like a data science interview question, like how can you use AI to make you rich? So that's the income part. If you go into that career, cost. Let's say if you want to maybe have not sure there are AI platforms that look into how your costing is. So I'm talking a bit more like practical, right? Like you say, common guy, monthly he gets paid some amount and monthly he spends some amount. Maybe AI can help him figure out where he can cut down in terms of cost. And eventually that will make you a lot of money, right? I mean, save a lot of money and become rich. That's on the costing part side. And then on the investment side, for a layman, the robo-advisor example is, I think it's quite practical for a very normal guy who doesn't know anything about investment. And just for the sake of, so currently, like, no, it's not financial advice or sponsored, it's just, I'm using Stashaway, like, and it's like monthly just deducts from my account and then just invest it. So that robo-advisor, I'm not sure how much of AI is in it, but it's doing that investment for me, and it's but allocating it. So the main value there is for me to not think about it a lot and just takes in a small amount and just invest it. And the other principle is like dollar cost averaging. Just because it takes it automatically every month, it does that. I don't have to think about it. So that's one way to amass wealth. Like, it will be quite small. Like, it's not like you'll be a overnight wealth. But that's one way you can try to use. But you should use it as you should see it as objectively as possible, as the tool itself. If I'm using Stashaway, is it going to give me that return? So you can, but assuming they're using AI, so you have to compare with others. So that's one way you staying ahead of others, right? Like, I can use that if the AI performance is actually as good. That's one way. Okay, how else can you use AI to as well? Secret, right? Yes. If it's too easy, everyone will do it, right?
Alright, so I hope that was insightful for people who want to make more money with AI. With that, this marks the end of our panel session. Once again, a big thank you to Mr. Suhasan, Mr. Foong, and Mr. Victor for a hearty enlightenment. So